Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Authority meeting. Apologies for those online. We're starting a little bit late because everyone was a bit delayed. We had an fire evacuation in this building for half an hour, and we also had just now a couple of problems with getting the mics to work, but everything is now functioning. Just so that everybody who's here in person, if you want to speak, you have to press the button on the speaker button on the big microphone. Ignore the smaller microphone, which stays on all the time. Yeah, that would be good. So, firstly, welcome. We have, I think, firstly, apologies and declarations of interest. We have one apology, which is from Francis Ashcroft, who, as you know, has some continuing health issues. Declarations of interest, please. Tim.
It is a switch off.
Yeah, you can do it.
Tim Child, clinician at a licensed clinic.
Great. Jason.
Jason Casray, person responsible at licensed clinic.
Thank you. Geeta.
Geeta Nagund, license holder and clinician at licensed clinic.
Great, thank you. And I think that's it. Yeah. Minutes of the last meeting they've all been circulated. Does anybody have any additional comments? So can I take the minutes as approved? Yep, thank you very much. There were some matters arising. As far as I could see, most of the matters arising are actually dealt with, are either ongoing or dealt with in this meeting, but let's just go very quickly. The first one is Debbie on including cyber risk 8.12. I think that's just closed now and feedback coming to AGC is required. That was from the 25th of January, and these are slightly later. Everybody's read them. I don't propose to go through them one by one, but has anybody got any comments on matters arising? Catherine.
Just a couple, and forgive me, I've got the wrong board number for one of them. I think it's 8.12. I just wanted to confirm that AGC has agreed to update to board as needed, and therefore I'd propose to close it from now on.
Thank you.
And 6.7, it's recommended that we close this. I would prefer, if you don't mind, that we don't close it, but rather that we transfer it to the AGC forward plan as an item for December 23 with a proposal to come back to full board if we decide to change it.
Absolutely fine. That's absolutely fine. I also just want to note that 7.15 is that the law reform consultation was actually launched on the 28th of February, and that will be dealt with later on in the agenda today. Anything else that anybody wishes to comment on, or can I take the matters arising as read? Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Okay, so now the next thing is the Chair and Chief Exec's report. My report is my activities as you can see in the papers. I gave some talks. Also, I think of particular note is that we had quite significant press comment, interestingly, when we launched the consultation for legislative reform on the 28th of Feb. There was a lot of interest in this consultation, and as you see, particularly I spoke on Women's Hour, which was very exciting. Peter was on the late BBC news programme. I think Claire did LBC. So there was really a lot of interest, which we hope will generate and encourage lots of responses. And we'll talk about that later in the meeting, but responses to date have been very good. The other thing that Peter and I are doing is we're doing some sort of whistle-stop tours around clinics, really to encourage perhaps some of the clinics that don't normally engage so much with us to really understand why we're doing this consultation, the benefits, and to engage with the process. And in particular, for me, I'm doing a sort of whistle-stop tour of Scotland next week in a couple of days. I'm doing Edinburgh, Glasgow, Dundee and Aberdeen, and Alison is coming with me for part of that. And we will also be meeting officials from the Scottish Parliament. We were going to meet the minister, but she suggested that we met officials instead, as she's unlikely to be the minister for very much longer, given the SNP, given the election. So they're in a bit of a state of flux, but we're grateful to them for making the time. And I think that will be really important to understand some of the issues in Scottish clinics and also to get them to engage in the consultation. So that's me. I'm going to hand over now to Peter.
Thank you, Julia. So picking up on where Julia left off, as you can see from there, I often go to visit clinics outside of the inspection cycle. It gives me a chance to kind of get a sense of, the sort of pressures clinics are under themselves, what they think of the regulatory regime more generally. And I think with a relatively small and focused sector like the one we regulate, it's really good practice actually to get a real sort of granular feeling for how things are on the ground. But Julia's quite right. In the light of the consultation on law reform, I've sort of picked up the pace of that the last few weeks and are going to see a few more clinics in the next couple of weeks as well. As I say, partly to have a conversation along the lines of the ones I often have with clinics, but really to talk to them in some detail about law reform, partly to encourage them to respond to the consultation, but also to discuss some of our proposals in detail. And I think those conversations, I've certainly found them very useful, and I hope all the clinics I've visited have, and I'm very grateful for them finding the time to accommodate me. In a similar vein, I was in Wales a few weeks ago, rather like Julia's visiting Scotland, where I took the time to meet to go to the Senate, to an FNUK event there, which was very well attended from both people from patient groups, but also Assembly members. But I also took the opportunity to meet the Welsh Health Minister. And the broader point here clearly is we are one of the unusual parts of health policy in this country in that our responsibilities are UK-wide. For the most part, health policy is devolved to the four constituent nations of the UK. Now, clearly, we have UK-wide legislation and fundamentally we're an arm's length body of the Department of Health, but we need good working relationships with the devolved nations because, our regulatory regime, if you like, has to fit with devolved health policy priorities. So just as Julia's visit to Scotland and mine to Wales, I think this is a dialogue we need to keep going because I think it's really important, notwithstanding our UK-wide responsibilities, that our rules make sense in the context of all the four parts of the UK. And again, I'm very grateful to the Welsh Health Minister for finding the time on that. I also should bring your attention to a conversation I and other chief executives had with the second permanent secretary of the Department of Health. And this is just a wider piece of work that the department is doing around the health system as a whole and looking at, efficiencies within that. I'll keep you up to date. It's very early days for that conversation, but I'll obviously keep the board up to date with that as it develops. And the last thing I ought to mention is I attended the recent international summit on gene editing at the CRIC. Indeed, I think Francis was there one day and some other staff were there that day. This is relevant clearly because, as you'll know, one of the things we are consulting on is about how we make the HFEA Act, or rather how we make arguments for the HFEA Act to, if you like, better accommodate developments in science in the future. Now, there are no concrete proposals on gene editing, but clearly that's one of the things that is doing the rounds at the moment. And I was very struck, I haven't got the communique in front of me, But it's clear from the summit at the CRIC that, and the communique that was issued at the end, is that whilst there has been very significant progress in somatic cell gene editing, which we do not have a regulatory interest in, progress in heritable gene editing of the embryo is proceeding at a much slower pace, and there are some very significant, if I leave to one side all the ethical questions, there are some very significant technical challenges which are still a long way from being overcome. So regardless, I think, of where people what position people take on the possibility of gene editing in treatment in the future, that for the moment is if you like, a debate and a decision which feels quite some years away at this stage. So I hope that's a helpful summary, and I'm obviously very happy to take any questions on anything I've raised.
Geeta.
Thank you, Peter. It's quite interesting that the point you said about meeting the Welsh Welsh Health Minister. Yes, we are a UK-wide regulator, when the accountability is mainly with the DHSC. How do you do that? Do you annually have some meetings with Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Ireland health? Anyway, Scottish and Welsh health ministers, and bring back their comments? And how do you integrate what they would like, their opinions are considered and implemented where it is necessary?
So, sorry, I think this should be green. Anyway, I hope everyone can still hear from me. So it's not quite as structured as that, Geeta, is the honest argument. And I think going ahead, perhaps it ought to be more structured. So we have regular dialogue at official level, particularly in Scotland, more occasional elsewhere. And the dialogue with ministers has been more ad hoc. So just for clarity and really for anybody listening in, clearly the interface is with, so if you decisions on, for example, commissioning of IVF services is a matter for each devolved parliament, just as it is for the Westminster Parliament. And indeed, the most stark difference is between the policies pursued in Scotland compared to England, where roughly about 60% of all treatment in Scotland is NHS funded and about 40% private, and that's roughly the reverse of the position in England, and that's due to different government policies on commissioning. So the question then is, if you like, is how do we have a set of regulatory rules that makes sense in terms of things like different commissioning policies, different maternity health policies and the like? Because as I say, I mean, most notably, and this is the point of devolution after all, to do things differently, there is quite considerable divergence between the position in Scotland and certainly the position in England. And that is a dialogue I think that we need to not just keep up, but probably intensify, actually. That's not to say, it is for each of those governments to decide what their policy should be, but it is important that we have a regulatory framework that works for clinics wherever they are in the UK. A Scottish clinic, for example, has to work with a set of policies coming out of the Scottish government and a set of regulatory rules made by the HFEA UK-wide. So that's a long answer to what has been, if you like, so far, regular but ad hoc engagement. But I think we do probably, going forward, need to put that onto a slightly more regular and formal footing.
Anybody else, any questions? Okay, thank you. So now we come to the committee chair's report, and can I start with Alison Marsden, please, of the Licence Committee?
Can you hear me? Okay. Well, as you can see, it's been a particularly busy time for the Licence Committee. I'm sure that members will have read the relevant minutes, so I won't go into details of the cases, but I just want to take this opportunity to thank my Deputy Chair, Graham, the other members of the Licence Committee for the high levels of work that have been undertaken recently, and also to thank the licensing team and the executive, with particular thanks to Paula Robinson, who's given us absolutely sterling support.
Can you hear me? Yes, thank you. You can see that AGC met on the 14th of March, and you've got a list of all the items that we covered. So I'll just add some highlights from that. First to report is that the Executive are making good progress with closing internal audit recommendations, and there's a clear plan to expect more of those to close quickly. We reviewed an early draft of the annual governance statement, and we proposed quite a few additions. We endorsed the addition of 3 new risks to the risk register, including an increased cybersecurity risk, not specific to the HFEA, but more generally reflective of the current cybersecurity climate, and PRISM's impact on progress with respect to other related systems. And we discussed at some length a general increase in the expectation for corporate governance reporting, specifically with reference to functional standards compliance and likely further mandatory elements of DSPT. And we agreed that because of this theme, that we would do a deep dive in this area in October because of the clear impact on allocation of HFEA resources. We reviewed and endorsed current fraud risks and the mitigations around those, and we agreed to do some good governance external training in December 23, and I just wanted to reiterate as usual that all authority members are very welcome to attend that training if you'd find it useful. I'll flag that closer to the time as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. In this last couple of months, SCAC, the Scientific and Clinical Advances Advisory Committee, met. So I'd like Tim to give an update on that, and in particular to talk about the add-ons timetable.
Hello. Oh, here we go. Yes, so SCAC had a hybrid meeting on the 6th of February where we discussed recent public health developments, and after review decided to continue to keep an eye on them. We went through the prioritisation of issues identified through the horizon scanning process and agreed the SCAC work plan for for the next year. And we also had a presentation and a discussion surrounding synthetic embryo-like entities and decided again to continue to keep an eye on that. The bulk of the meeting was a discussion of the review of ratings for the treatment add-ons, sort of the traffic light system. However, we did decide to not allocate any ratings since we realised that there was more work that was required in terms of the search process and the development of the finding of the relevant papers for the independent statistician to go through. And so there's a lot of work going on at the moment regarding this, and we plan to have that review at the June SCAC meeting.
And Jonathan, please, for Statutory Approvals Committee.
Thank you. You've got the bare facts in the paperwork. One of the things I thought I'd expand on is that what those don't capture is that when we do have an application for a condition to consider for PGT, we're often also asked to consider very similar conditions to avoid repeated applications in the future. We very much have to rely on the peer reviewer and our expert scientific advisor when we do that. And we generally take quite a cautious approach. So where we can license similar conditions, we do so. But quite regularly, there are conditions we feel we haven't quite got enough information and we have to leave for a specific application. But certainly in some of these cases, we've been licensing, in addition to the one applied for, a further 20 or so conditions to try and speed things up for patients. Thank you.
I just want to say, and I regularly observe different committees, and this period I observed one of the Statutory Approvals Committee meetings. And it's worth reminding members, I think, that we now license, I think, over 600 conditions. I mean, and every single month that number increases. It's extraordinary, the number of really very unpleasant and often life-limiting conditions that there are. And every month we do more, and it's a huge amount of work for the committee. So I think it's worth recognising that and recognising the contribution that members make to that committee, because it means that once that condition is licensed, then if somebody else comes, with that committee, they don't have to go through the whole process again, and it's short-circuited. So it's really, really important, and it's, as I say, worth recognising not only the contribution that members make, which is quite a burden, but also the fact that each month there are more and more conditions licensed, and less, and therefore fewer people who have to go through this agonising waiting for a decision. So it's great. Thank you. Right, so as members know, at each meeting, we consider a performance report, and we invite the directors to highlight any key issues in their particular area. Rachel Cutting is unable to be with us because she's unavoidably on authority business today. So I'm going to invite Peter actually to do her bit for her. Hand over to you.
Thanks, Julia. Right, number of things to cover. I'd like to start with staff sickness and turnover, partly because, as members will know, I think for almost every authority meeting for a very long time now, I have touched on sickness and in particular turnover. I'm pleased to report that both are coming down. They're gradual declines. The staff sickness one, with the small organisation, is always distorted by, you have a couple of members of staff off long-term sick. That distorts the figures. And it may well be, as we're also coming out of the sort of winter cold and flu season, that is helping. The turnover figure is now approaching our sort of target of 15% or less sort of thing. That's welcome. It's clearly still quite high for a small specialist body like ourselves, but it's certainly it's good to see the graph at least coming down in the right direction. So that is I'm certainly pleased about that. I'd also like to take the opportunity to record some improvements in performance on not just licensing, which is at the end of the process. We're now back certainly in January in terms of back at 100%, which is partly about the efforts of the inspection team, but also of course all of you involved in licensing, whether at the licence committee or ELP. I'm very grateful for that. But also I'd like to report some notable improvements in inspection performance. We're still not where we want to be, but if you remember, we've been through a period where actually we weren't getting through inspection reports to the KPIs we wanted. Now, we always thought my commentary on this, or Rachel's commentary on this, was not that this was a structural issue. It reflected, if you like, complexities of particular issues. And we've always taken the view that what we want is a tough KPI that we don't meet sometimes, rather than an easy one. And if need be, we then just have need to explain to you why we've failed to meet them. But both in terms of inspection reports to committee and inspection reports to PR, which are part of the process, they're both going in the right direction. And again, I'm very grateful to inspectors in what otherwise has been a very, very busy time. Having said that things are getting better, I do want to signal to you they're likely in the next couple of months or so to dip again. And again, that is not because of some sort of structural reason. It really is to do with particular complexities. We only need a very difficult inspection and sort of licensing to really dent progress on these KPI numbers. And as it says to you in the management commentary there is some very complex inspection and licensing matters under the way at the moment, which means that some of those reports definitely will not be within the normal KPI target. But I think generally we are making some real progress in that, but I do want to thank staff for, coping with some of the pressures and complexities in all of this. On OTR, so that's opening the register for those people listening, as you know. We are now, so we're at a position now where we have a team. If you remember, we took a decision to try and recruit and increase the capacity of the team. We managed to do that. And we've also managed, to do the training, which is vital, because until they've done the training, we don't get the full efficiency out of staff. But I'm afraid to say that capacity has also been met by an increase in applications. So we are at the position at the moment where basically we are dealing with as many OTRs as we are receiving applications. But unfortunately, we still have the backlog to deal with. Now, we're prioritising those in the backlog because they've been there a long time. But what that effectively means is, although the team is working very hard indeed, the total number is not coming down in the way that we want. Now, clearly, we are going to have to keep the issue of team capacity, the size of the team, under review. We are also investing in work to improve the underlying systems that the team use, which we hope will mean, regardless of how many members of staff we have on OTR, they are able to get through more applications because they are supported by better IT. And that work on that is progressing well. I know the team were shown by our developers the kind of application that is being designed for them in order to extract register data to do OTR, the OTR process, and they're very pleased with what we're able to build. And it looks like, if everything runs to plan, those tools should be available around about July, which will give them the remainder of the summer to get confident with them before, of course, we reach OTR properly. So that looks quite positive, and that finally gets me onto PRISM. You've got the basic data there. It looks like by the end of this financial year, we will be in a position where all bar 3 clinics are using PRISM or using a third-party system which connects to PRISM. The fact that 3 clinics are outside of that does not impact on our forecasting or anything, and it's to do with a particular technical issue about the way in which these clinics want to change to another third-party supplier, and the transfer of data to do that is just inevitably complex and takes time. So what we are doing now on PRISM, if you like, is we're getting typically overall error rates, as it says there, of around about 4%. That's significantly below error rates in the old system. That's obviously a good thing. It does vary a bit amongst different third-party suppliers, and we're working with the suppliers to bring that variation down. What we've now got to do is a piece of work in conjunction with clinics to deal with some fine print errors that were transferred in when all the historic data was transferred. We're issuing that in 3 tranches. Don't know if it's, yes. So of the first tranche, and I'm very grateful for clinics, they've already dealt with just over 70% of all the errors we sent them. The second tranche has just gone out. I don't, I'm afraid, have figures for that. But we're clearly, we believe we're making good progress on all of this. And around about June, July, we will be able to give a firm estimate as to when we can then run an update of our Choose a Fertility Clinic function, which is now, of course, quite out of date because of the transfer of data from PRISM. Last thing to say is we, of course, update on PRISM at every Audit and Governance Committee meeting. I'm hugely grateful for the time and oversight that AGC provides. I think it's fair to say, Catherine, PRISM has at times been, more than a slog and had its problems. But I think at the moment, we look on track to complete the remaining elements of this. And I think the general view of both ourselves doing the work and AGC is that we're in a pretty good place.
I think you're still on.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks, Peter. Has anyone got any comments, questions for Peter? Yeah, Alison.
Hi, thanks for that, Peter. How are you going to get the feedback from clinics? Is there a stakeholder group being created? You said there's some fine-tuning, and I'm aware from centres that there's some fine-tuning needed for some cases. So I just wonder how the HFEA are engaging with the sector about particular issues.
Yes. No, you're absolutely right. So what this is not, to be clear, we don't believe we are missing cycles of treatment or anything like that. What we're talking about is, if you can imagine a cycle of treatment has a whole host of, as anybody who works in a clinic knows, not just name, address, NHS number, partners, a whole bunch of fine print sort of details. And in some cases, some of the data that transferred across, has errors in it. And what we need to do is clean that up before the update of Choose a Fertility Clinic. So Kevin Hudson, who is our project manager on this, has a regular open call with clinics. I can't remember if it's weekly or 2 weekly, which is an opportunity for clinics to discuss some of the fine print of all of this. There is a general issue with what are called gamete movements. So this is where the treatment doesn't just take place in the clinic you might be running yourself, but you need to also, send gametes to another clinic, and the way in which those are recognised in the data. We're doing some underlying work on all of that, including we have now allocated a unique identifier to every record in the register. We can't use the NHS number because it's not uniformly spread across the whole register. Now that we've got that and we're doing the final few edge cases, I think we've got down to less than 5,000 out of 1.6 million. That will then provide that underlying identifier, which allows us to unlock problems like the final issues on gamete movements. So in total data terms, we believe we have 99% of the data we should have, and we have about 1% of these missing movements and the like. Now, clearly, from the individual perspective, because the database is so big, 1%, can equal quite a few, but we really are in the small margins here. So if anybody from a clinic is listening and they're not already engaging with Kevin and the team, please do get in touch, whether initially with your inspector or to the register team more generally, and let us know your problems. Because to some extent, if we're not told there's a problem, we don't know there's a problem. But there is a regular open dialogue, I think, with clinics at the moment, which my sense is, from when I've gone out and talked to clinics, everybody acknowledges there's a few minor tricky things to resolve, but they do acknowledge that dialogue is there and open and is working.
Geeta.
Can you hear me? Peter, thank you for that summary. Just following on about PRISM, it has been a lot of work. I have to say, from a clinic end, huge amount of work, and a lot of people have worked really hard and then overtime to achieve that. And I agree that there's been an open dialogue with the HFEA team who are helping a lot, and there's been a lot of issues with third-party suppliers rather than direct clinical staff there. When you say 4.3% error rate, and you said that was okay, it's not about cycles missing, is it? It's more just minor data sets missing.
So these are records where there is an error in them. That's not the same. So they're not missing records. They are records that are not complete. I don't have the figures in front of me. For those clinics that use PRISM Direct, the error rate is about 1%. So, there is a bit of an issue between the interface between the third-party patient record systems that many clinics use and the kind of PRISM system. And, that can be a whole series of reasons, often to do with, things beyond which I can't really describe, Geeta, but they're sort of, if you like, technical mismatches between the way in which the patient record system in the clinic counts something and the way PRISM counts something, and these sorts of, but to get down to, the crucial thing is there's not 4.3 missing cycles. These are 4.3% of, cycles that we have in the register that have been submitted under PRISM have errors of some kind, but they literally could be,
Okay. Well, I'd just like to actually thank and congratulate everyone involved in making this happen, because there's been a lot of work from the clinic end and as well as the HFEA. Yeah, thank you.
Alex.
Thanks. I had a sneak preview of the new OTR functionality from Rachel and the team. I have to say it looks great, and just echo Peter's comments, and I think it will increase throughput of dealing with it and errors and something. And the team had considered a number of different use cases, the questions that might come in and queries and how we'll deal with it, and I actually volunteered fellow members when we get to the beta testing phase that we can kind of put some volume tests in there, and there might be other use cases that members close to patients and clinics that we haven't thought of yet. So I think they'll do that in due course, but it's looking really good.
Thank you. Gudrun.
Does that work? So I'm a bit confused as how you would know if there was a whole record missing. Because if it was missing, it would be missing, and you wouldn't know. And the second thing to say is, presumably for the 4.3% of data that's missing from records you do have, can any of that be imputed? Because lots of data sets can have imputation, have a program that imputes the data. So it becomes a whole set of data with obviously holes in it, but holes that you know about. So when you send that data out, you know that there are 2 records that don't have age of dad, or so you can actually work with imputation very successfully and get very good data from those without worrying about your 4.3% before you allow the data to go out.
You're right, Gudrun. I'm in danger of straying into territory where, my knowledge is a bit thin. So I think there's 2 issues here. For historic data, and certainly when we prepare data for researchers to use, indeed, particularly data's quite old, that's exactly the kind of tools and techniques we need to do when we prepare linkage studies and the like, and other people do that. So the data I referred to at the moment is simply, if you like, it's the most recent data it's that bit of data which has not been validated yet. So it's the data that transferred from the old system into PRISM, that's post-validation, and it's also the data that's currently submitted on PRISM. So we're talking about the most recent data in our register, and because those are effectively live or recently completed treatments, we can work with the clinics to plug those gaps as appropriately, which is slightly different from how do we treat historic absences. On your other point, you're right. I mean, philosophically, it must be true. How do we know that we don't hold something that we don't know about? What I would say about that is this, in the sense that it is a requirement of all PRs to submit accurate data to us. That is set out in general directions, and then we also do sample audits periodically to check that the data sets we've got broadly match what we would expect. So can I hand on heart tell you that every one of the 1.6 treatment cycles in the register, it's the sum total of treatment that's ever been done in license over the last 30 years? No, because nobody could, short of us checking. But given the legal framework, given the sign-off by PRs, et cetera, I think it is reasonable to assume, and the audits we do, that it's a pretty accurate number.
And also, does it matter? Because if you're missing a few records for whatever reasons, that they weren't annotated properly or never got, I'm not sure that it matters in the big scheme of use of the data.
You're right, in the sense of when one's looking for trends from aggregate data and the like, the fact that some are missing, I don't think is a consequence at all. It clearly matters that we have broadly the right number in because it's a regulatory requirement that is so. And for as long as we have a fee model based on effectively treatment volumes, each of those treatments attracts is about public income. So our auditors are of a view that needs to be a reasonably accurate figure. What I would say is over the 30-odd years of the HFEA existence, it produces annual reports each year. Those are externally audited, and the auditors are happy that the figures we report, and therefore the income that's generated from it, is sufficiently robust and accurate that they're then approved and laid in Parliament. So, but you're right. If we ignore all the regulatory stuff and just talk about how do we get best use of the data, you're absolutely right. A few missing cycles is frankly neither here nor there.
Thank you. Anybody else? In which case I'm going to hand over now to Claire.
Thanks, Julia. Just a brief update from me. Just to note for the record that all members will have received a committee calendar for the next year outlining all the formal committees for 2024, so I encourage you to mark your diaries accordingly. Most of the other things that I would mention cover the projects and activities under other items on the agenda, particularly relating to the consultation on law reform and the opening the register work. But in the meantime, our day-to-day work of answering some very complex patient inquiries and freedom of information requests continues. We continue to participate in as many public events as possible. So recently we've taken part in fertility network events. Rachel has been recording some training for the RCOG. We're working with the British Fertility Society on the Joint Study Week event, which is in September, on how to run an effective fertility service. And we've also done some more informal work with Beaker and the Donor Conception Network. In terms of particular areas of work, so I think Tim mentioned that there's a delay in the publication of our updated add-ons because SCAC is looking a bit more in detail about various aspects of that. So we hope to publish the new add-ons ratings towards the summer, and we'll come back to authority with a final update once those have been published. There's a number of concurrent projects, some of which don't get as far as authority at this stage, but will do in due course. So we've got the Code of Practice coming later this afternoon. We're also looking at authorised processes. There's 3 different pieces of work looking at the opening the register, which I'll talk about later, and of course our work on Act reform. In the intelligence team, as well as dealing with some of these complex queries and some media work, which I'll talk about in a minute, we are preparing as far as possible to update fertility trends with unvalidated data, which we're hoping to publish in June, and more of that in due course. And finally, in communications, I just wanted to mention that our new head of communications, Anne Harrod Thomas, came to talk to the authority at the end of 2022 in private about our new communication strategy, and thank you for your helpful feedback. I think we're beginning to see the fruition of that, and depending which database you believe, our coverage in general has gone up somewhere between 50% and 200% on this time last year. The consequences of that are obviously that we are, I'm very pleased to see the go-to place for all national outlets to come for information about fertility treatment and data. The consequence of that is obviously, someone somewhere has to provide that. And there is, as you would expect, a media drive to have as much new and up-to-date data as possible. So I think we just need to keep an eye on that. We have got one person in our press office. We call it a press office, but really it's actually only one person. So we just need to make sure that our ambitions match the capacity and the resources we have available. I think that's it, because everything else I will probably cover under the other items on the agenda.
Anybody got any questions or for Claire? Gita.
Just a point of clarity. Claire, as regards to add-ons publications, did you say that the add-ons are due to be published in the summer and then they'll come to the authority, or is it the other way around? So they'll come to the board and then they get published?
So what came to the authority was the new rating system, which, if you remember, has gone from a 3 traffic lights to a 5 system. That's then kind of metaphorically handed over to SCAC, who then look through the individual add-ons and give them a rating, and then that is published. So it doesn't come, it's a SCAC decision, the individual ratings given to any add-on. What I was saying is that sort of towards the end of the year, given that authority have seen this work through the update to the new rating system, that we would come and give a kind of roundup of where things were and next steps after that later in the year.
Any other questions for Claire? Firstly, I think a big thanks is due to Claire and her team with Anne Howard and Lauren and so on, because I've personally noticed a huge uptake in press comment, in requests for interviews. We've all been out there, and I think this is hugely helpful. I really recognise the stress on the team, because it's meant a huge extra work, but I think it really has paid dividends, and we're becoming now far more of a voice on important matters, not only what we directly regulate, but areas which are sort of in which we should have an interest, and perhaps in the past we've not really had the bandwidth to have a voice, and we now do. So well done, and I think the press interest, media interest, shall we say, over the launch of the consultation was a really good example of how important this is and how it really works in practice. So great. Richard, over to you.
Thank you. A brief update from me. So in terms of the in-year position, obviously the performance reporting that comes to the board is always a little bit behind where we are financially. So we've already settled our period 11 accounts, and we're only 9 days from year end. So we're now pretty certain where we're going to end up. So the year end forecast you see in the paper has not changed much since that point. We are still estimating a total surplus across the year of around £350,000 pounds. Forgetting where I was for a second. To Peter's point around reconciliation of clinics, we've now been able to reconcile all but 3 clinics against estimated income. So they now have received their final reconciliation bill from us. That pleases me in the sense that we now have a firm income position, and very much pleases our auditors, who were very concerned last year at the position we had in terms of how many we were still estimating. So that's a good position to be in. In terms of where we are with the debt, as you'll see, there's a couple of red indicators in my area around debt recovery. Inevitably, because we've been estimating and in reconciling invoices, we have had delays in getting those invoices paid, which has increased the debtor days in terms of the time it's taken for people to pay the bills we send them. It's not a huge concern. We do eventually get these settled, but it's much higher than I'd like it to be, and the team's certain focus over the next few weeks is to try and get as much of that income in through the door before we close the books for this year, to ensure that debtor position is much further down than it currently is. Just quickly reflecting on next year, SMT approved a draft budget for 23-24 earlier this month, which we are fairly comfortable with. We are still awaiting final confirmation from the department in terms of our position for granting aid funding, and indeed Peter and I are with the department next week to finalise some of that, with conversations around our budgets and so forth. So we would expect that to be confirmed relatively soon and settle the budget. There's no real concern around that, but obviously the authority will see the 23-24 budget at the next meeting.
Thanks, Richard. Any comments or questions for Richard? No. So let's move on to the item on effective governance. So as many of you are aware, it's really good practice that public bodies review their governance on a regular basis. And we do an annual review of the effectiveness of the committees. This has just been done, and firstly, I'm very grateful to all committee members who've inputted into that review. It's very important work, and they've given up their time, which has been very helpful. As a result of this work, we've had to look and see if our standing orders need to be reviewed, and there is a bit of a review, and I'd like Debbie, please, to introduce this paper and just explain the changes that we might need to make before we have to make a decision on this.
So switch off, please.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair. Just to reiterate what Julia said, thank you very much, authority members, because a lot of you sit on more than one committee, so it's a lot of work that you're putting in, so thank you very much. I'll go straight to section 2 of your reports that you've all got. It's on page 34, and you'd all see the summary of the reviews, the areas of note and matters that members believe will improve effectiveness of committees. Again, similar to last year, the committee secretaries or / committee officers are going to be working with the respective chairs and the committee members to update the action plan to make sure that we're moving forward in the right direction. A number of areas of improvement have also been highlighted, and yes, all this is going to be worked on. So be rest assured, your work is not in vain. I ask that you all note the feedback unless there are any questions, Chair, on that particular area of it.
None from me. Are any questions from the floor?
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. So moving on to the change in standing order, there's it's not slight, I wouldn't say slight. It's on the Audit and Governance Committee, and it's to have the option to co-opt members with particular expertise, because as was discussed during the meeting on committee effectiveness, it was felt that this would have been an advantage when we started with the review on PRISM. So you all received a notice of motion, on notice, sorry, on 22nd of February. So if there are no dissents, we'll need you to vote, please, so we can note it in the minutes, if you all agree, because you have the updates attached to your papers.
Thank you, Debbie. That's very clear. So we have to vote on whether we can make this change to the AGC, which is to allow to co-opt members. Gudrun.
I was just going to say, I think it looks good. So I was saying yes to vote.
Excellent. I think the easiest way is everybody in favour just raise their hands. Thank you. I'm seeing, for those on the computer, a lot of hands. Anybody against? No. So I think you have your change carried. And I think we should also note that there are action points for some of the committees coming out of the review, which we will monitor, make sure they're carried out, and these reviews will be carried out annually. I think it's also, I'd just like to say that, of course, an equally important review is board effectiveness review for the authority. The authority members met last September for a sort of two-day session, during which time we looked at our own effectiveness, and there were some action points arising out of that based on how we could improve our effectiveness and the way that the board is run. We agreed that we would test the temperature of that and see where we'd got to at sort of midpoint, and then revisit at the annual point. So the midpoint was actually about now, and this morning the members met just to look at what we had decided last September in terms of board effectiveness, and we came up with a list of things that might be helpful and action points arising out of that, and then we will revisit in detail at the annual point, which will be around September 2023. So I just thought that's worth noting, and it's something that we take very seriously on this board, and we'll continue to do and to monitor. Anybody, any questions or comments? No? Thank you. So now we come to the Code of Practice update, which will also require a decision. As you know, as members know, we're required by law to produce a Code of Practice. You all read it, I'm sure. It's an essential regulatory tool for the fertility sector. It's also, given that we're in a very fast-moving field of medicine, something that we need to review regularly, and which we might need to make changes to or tweaks to very regularly. We're going to hear from Niamh, who's going to introduce the paper, and then we'll have to after a discussion, we'll have to take a decision on whether we make some changes now or we make some changes at a later date. But I'll hand over to Niamh Marin now, and then we can have a discussion.
Thank you, and I hope you can all hear me. Thanks, Shabir. So yeah, I'm not going to go through all of the changes in detail, because I assume you've read the annex changes and the paper, so these slides won't take too long, hopefully. So the areas of guidance that we change combine legislative changes. This includes anything that has been changed in law since the Code of Practice was last updated in October 2021. And these have already been communicated to the sector and are already in force. The next one is the least substantive changes, and this is mainly due to things that we have clarified in clinic focus articles or queries that we received that we feel are important to include in the next Code of Practice update. And then there are other changes, and these are ones that are a bit more substantial, and they might something that we have already got guidance on, but we may need to clarify. legislative change. Back, please. Back. Back one more. No. Yes, thank you. So the legislative changes. So there have been 2 changes to legislation since October 2021. These include the Health and Social Care Act 2022, and these changes incorporate all of the storage requirements that came into force in July last year. These have already been communicated to the sector. These are already in force, and our current code of practice has all of the previous storage changes used as strike-through. So we have non-code information for the sector at the minute on our portal. The second change is there was an extension made to the Medical Device Regs 2002. So we refer to these regulations in some of our licence conditions, which means that clinics can use CE-marked devices after the 1st of July 2023. And the MHRA will be issuing further guidance on this, but we needed to make a clarification because we do have the dates specified in some of our licence conditions. Now, the least substantive changes. So like I mentioned, these were ones that have already been communicated to the sector in terms of clinic focus articles. I'm not going to go through each of these in a lot of detail. As you've seen them in the annexes, they tend to be quite short ones. The only thing that wasn't in the annex was the change to version control, which will make it easier for clinics to know which version they're referring to and within what dates. So we want to improve that code going forward. The other changes, now these are 2 that I will go just 2 brief slides on each of these. So these are to be highlighted. They were to clarify existing HFEA guidance or if there was anything that was some confusion in the sector. So we thought these were given priority for this update. So the first was the CMA recommendation. This was in their 2022 Compliance Review Findings report. They made the recommendation that clinics who treat private patients or clinics who are treated in a private facility should subscribe to an ADR service. In line with that, we felt it was important to highlight for patients treated in NHS facilities that they can complain through PALS and the relevant ombudsman as well. And we wanted to make it clear that all patients should receive sufficient information on the routes available to them to escalate a complaint. So in terms of cancelling a benefit in kind arrangement, this was something that we needed to clarify because we received inquiries through our compliance team of who bears the burden if a benefit in kind arrangement falls through. In our current guidance, we have it that a gamete provider or recipient can withdraw their consent after preparation for treatment has begun, but each clinic can define their own definition of preparation. So we wanted to make that clearer in our code of practice, and also make sure that that is communicated to gamete providers and recipients when entering into a benefit in kind arrangement. We also wanted to make sure that they are aware of the actions being taken, if there's any implications, and the risk of withdrawing their consent, and make sure that all of that information is included in the benefit in kind agreement and also in the patient's written information. So this is just the slide that has all of the guidance that we would require your approval for if we went forward with the publication of this code. I won't go into all these details. And then, as you had seen in the paper, there were 2 options for members to choose from. So one is to publish the code this year, and the other was to postpone publication. Now, in terms of publishing the code this year, it would mean that we would be able to make substantial changes to the code in terms of the storage regulations. Now, these have a large impact on all patients and all clinics. It'll also include all of the guidance draft that you have seen in the annexes. In the paper, we outlined that there may be additional draft guidance that we would like you to potentially review outside of an authority meeting. Some of those, they may include something to do with the Windsor framework, the MHRA guidance on the CE marking, and if there's any professional body guidelines published imminently. We also have already let the sector know that there will be a publication towards the end of this year. Now, in terms of postponing, this means that we could choose to postpone until after the transitional period, which is part of the storage changes, which is July 2024. This may also give us the chance to include any clarifications in terms of the Windsor framework, any updated professional guidelines and MHRA guidance. If anything came up in the meantime, we could inform the sector through clinic focus articles or letters from Chief Exec, Chair or Chief Inspector. This would prevent us having to strike through any out-of-date guidance, similar to what we're doing for storage at the minute. The sector would have to continue to use the non-code information in terms of the storage changes. So that is the clinic guide on the portal. We have a specific new storage laws page for that, and referring to any clinic focus in the meantime. If we decide to postpone, when it came to publication again, we would also have to prioritise anything that has come up in the meantime that we feel will need further guidance, that will need approval from the authority. We didn't have it in the paper, but the one that we would recommend is publishing the code this year. But I would appreciate any of your feedback or questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Claire.
Thanks, Niamh. But just before we hear from members, I just wanted to add a couple of words about context, which I think would help the decision, well, maybe not help, but give background to the decision. So for those people in clinics, code is the rule book. So, you know, we want it to be up to date as possible. We know many nurses in particular are using it on their phone, which is not kind of ideal. But so having something that, you know, massively is out of date in terms of the strike through of the storage changes is not really helpful. Although we should say the guidance is being made available on the clinic guide on the clinic portal, publicly accessible. So it's not as if the guidance isn't available, but it's not available in that code of practice. So the proposal that Niamh has outlined is to go ahead with the current update. The other thing I should say is that we try not to update this every 2 or 3 months for various reasons. One is because we need Secretary of State or ministerial sign-off for every update, which takes time. And secondly, it's not very helpful if you're sitting in a clinic every 5 minutes saying, you know, here's a new version. So it's a kind of not one-time opportunity, but we don't want to make it a too frequent thing. I suppose the only pause that we've got in the decision-making is that there are some aspects to both professional body guidance and the impact of the Windsor framework, which relates to Northern Ireland clinics, particularly in relation to potential changes for transfer of gametes and embryos between clinics in GB and Northern Ireland and vice versa, and then clinics in Northern Ireland and the rest of the EU. So it gets sort of quite complicated, but has an impact on parts of the code of practice as well. And I think what we're looking for from authority members, particularly those who are based in clinics, is kind of better to have an out-of-date code that's not updated very often, or have the majority of up-to-date, but risking that later in the year, parts of it come out of date as well. Sorry, that wasn't worded very well. Does that summarise things? Okay.
Thank you, Claire. Alison, then Jason.
Thanks for that. The code of practice is always an interesting one, isn't it? And you're right, it's used daily in centres. But what I was going to say is that one of the reasons that it's not necessary to rush in and update every time, and I think it's something that you could maybe highlight to centres, is that if they go into the clinic portal, because I've just gone in to check it, the second part of the Bible is the list of licence conditions. And I see that the ones that you've mentioned are already updated and on the portal. So I think pointing centres to look at that would be helpful, because it's not updating the code, but it's there, written for people to see, which would make it easier to postpone the new version till next year. And I'm not aware that everybody knows that the clinic licence conditions are listed so well on the clinic portal.
Thank you. I'm aware of some relatively significant guidelines that are coming out from ARCS and BFS in the next year or so, hopefully. Some of them have been brewing for a long time, particularly around ICSI, and scientific staffing will be quite a big one. If we do publish this year, my question is, how long until we update again, bearing in mind there might be some significant guidelines coming out from professional bodies?
is working. Okay, thank you. Yes, we have been discussing the ICSI guidelines from ARCS internally as well, but we have a process internally of how often we publish, and it all depends on how many things come up as high priority in that time. If the professional body guidelines come relatively soon, then it's something that we'll be able to ask authority members to consider and approve outside of the meeting for hopefully publication towards the end of this year. But as we don't know dates at the minute, I can't promise as to when we'll be communicating those to you.
Thank you. Jason, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I guess the other part of the question was, if we do publish this year, if we miss that, if the professional bodies miss that deadline, how long until the next update of the Code of Practice?
I think that's an authority discussion to be had, because it's not an insignificant piece of work, and we could publish it every 6 months, frankly. There would be enough to kind of do a new update. So I think that we would come back to authority really to look for kind of whether authority agree that's a priority, and, you know, we'll do it next year. But I think that's for an authority discussion about where that falls within other things within the business plan, because can't do everything. I think that where we are is the current timetable that we've sort of agreed with the department is to try and publish in October, but the aim is really by the end of this calendar year. So if the professional body guidance comes out in the summer, we've still got an opportunity. I think if it comes out in November, we start losing time.
Thank you, Niamh, for that very comprehensive summary for all of us. It is extremely important, as my colleagues pointed out. It is a rule book. Have you done any risk assessment of publishing now versus postponing until everything is clear, which will happen next year? You know, the outstanding items on transition period ending, the MHRA looking at it, the Windsor framework being established and all that. My question is, have you done any risk assessment? And if you have, could you tell us what it says?
You have to come quicker.
In a word, no. I have not, but I don't know if Peter or Claire have had further discussions on postponing or publishing in terms of risk, but no, I haven't done a risk assessment for this.
I think it comes back to that original point of the risk of the current code with lots of information being struck through versus a new code where the majority of the information is correct, but then there may be new updates that are not in there. It's a judgment call, I think.
Claire, just so that we can be absolutely clear, and then I'll come back to you, Geeta. I mean, I think the updating the code now really affects all patients. It's really important, and the option 2 is likely to be much more limited in who it affects. So I think we just need to be clear about that going forward, I think. Geeta, have you wanted to make a comment back, or?
Thank you. No, my comment was probably my answer to this. It is really, there is no additional risk knowing the information is already there for practitioners in the form of portal, clinic focus. I would be of the opinion to postpone it. But then we will be taking a vote on that anyway. Yeah.
Catherine.
Thank you. Being a real pedant and a lay member of the authority, I did actually read through all the annexes and look at the quantum of the changes. And firstly, I'd endorse Julia's point about the enormity of impact of the storage changes on a number of patients. But secondly, the number of particular additions and particular deletions suggests to me that it's more important on balance to get this out firmly into the public domain as the definitive record, not least because there may well be, like the Firth of Forth Bridge, there may well be a series of additions to consider at future points, but those which are going to affect fewer patients seem to me to have less priority and therefore lower risk than the risk of not publishing within the timescale that's currently envisaged.
Jason.
Yeah, I think on balance I have to agree. I think it's better to publish now and have everything in one place. That reduces risk. There are still, sadly, a lot of people who will just refer to the code of practice and think it will reduce risk and also help clinics to have it all in one place.
Yeah. Graham.
Was I right, Claire, in understanding that you said that for the code to be changed and published, it needed Secretary of State approval, which is why this is a slow process? I mean, I'm surprised at that, because actually much of what you're including is what is legislation anyway. And I just wonder whether or not this isn't something that we should seek some change in, because it strikes me most codes of practice would have an annual updating in a, as a matter of course, and for this to always be lagging what is current practice seems to me sort of bad practice in itself, isn't it? It just seems odd. What sort of code of practice has bad practice in it without, referring to another document? I'm sorry, I realise I'm a layperson here, but it just doesn't make much sense to me.
You make a very fair point, Graham. It's written in the Act of 1990. I suspect it reflects... So we are required, according to the Act, to produce a code of practice, which effectively provides, if you like, a sort of guide, if you like, isn't it? It's a book of guidance to licensed clinics. I suspect it probably reflects the circumstances in which the Act was written, in which this was all very new. And the Act generally, as you know, has a lot of things in quite prescriptive detail. That's part of the hallmark of its time. And I certainly think if the authority is of the view that that time has sort of outlasted its usefulness for all the reasons you suggest, when we put some proposals to the department later in the year on some ideas for reform, I see no reason at all why that isn't part of that wider package. The fact that's not been one of the themes we've consulted on so far, I don't think rules that out, because on the whole we were, if you like, consulting on big themes, and to some extent one of those themes was an issue more generally about the degree to which the Act, if you like, is prescriptive or provides a sort of general regulatory framework with which there are freedom. And to some extent, your point goes to the heart of that question. So we'll store that up on the list for when we have the conversation later in the year, if that's okay.
Any other comments before we sort of vote on this? So what we've got is we've got two options. The first is to publish the code this year, and just to reiterate the point that is affects all patients. So it relates to, for example, storage changes, things that are quite current, or we postpone until after the transitional period, which is after June 2024. Bearing in mind that we know that there will be other changes that will have to be made going forward. But again, taking Catherine's point that we don't know when those changes will come into force and how many there'll be. So we don't really have much idea of what updates will be needed or the timetable for that, which is sort of a bit more difficult to second guess. I think it's very easy. Put your hand up if you're in favour of option 1. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hands, 8 hands. I can't count. And put your hand up if you're in favour of option 2. That's 2. Okay. So I think option 1 is carried, and that's what we'll go with. So Niamh, you have your answer, but we bear in mind what the reservations of Alison and Geeta, and we'll make sure that this process, when we come to updating again, is as simple as possible. But I think Graham's got a really good point that perhaps as the authority, as we get closer towards finalising proposals after the consultation to go to the department, this might be an area that we would like to think about and perhaps come up with some proposals for sort of simplifying the updates to the Code of Practice and how it all works in connection with the primary legislation. Yeah, it sounds like that sounds like a sensible thing to do. Okay, we started a bit late. We are doing well. I'll offer this to members if they like. We could just plough on and then sort of have a cup of tea after the meeting finishes rather than take a break now. With that, am I seeing nods? Thank you. I think it's also more helpful for people dialing in as well. Yeah? Okay, great. The next item, which I'm going to ask Claire to speak about, is OTR. At the January Authority meeting, we were given an overview of the work on opening the register. Given the importance of this and in preparation for removal of anonymity in sort of autumn of this year or thereabouts, I think we've asked for this to be a standing item at every authority meeting for the next little while. And so I'm going to ask Claire to give us an update now.
Thanks, Julia. So as you said, this is the first of these updates that we'll be doing throughout the authority meetings during 2023. I suspect this is one that there is probably less to update than there will be in future. And apologies, you've got the poor relation because Rachel's otherwise engaged today. But I'll try and cover as much as I can in terms of her areas. So just a very brief overview of updates since we last met formally in January. So continued national media interest in the area, particular coverage that is linked in the paper. There was an iNewspaper article which covered the whole process and the kind of challenges of 2023. As Julia mentioned, there was a piece on Women's Hour following the consultation on ACT work, and a piece in the New Scientist, the New Scientists were looking at kind of what are the big scientific and ethical issues coming up in 2023, and this is one of their kind of top ones that they picked on. Ongoing interest from documentary companies who continue to approach us, who want to do different types of programs, both TV and radio, kind of following the journey, if you like, from people who might be accessing that information in the autumn, families involved, etc. I'll talk a bit more about the activity in the 3 work streams that we've got ongoing, and we're now focusing on how we can fully resource those work streams over the next financial year, together with the other pressures we have on other activity. That's just an overview of what I'm going to talk about, so we can probably go to the next slide, Shabir, thanks. So just a reminder, we've kind of divided the work just to try and keep it manageable into 3 key areas. The first one, crucially, looking at the service specifically, and Peter mentioned a bit about staffing of that service in looking at in the performance report. We're looking at the structure and the IT resources available for processing the applications, and Alex also mentioned that there was a demo of that new IT system, which looks like it will start to reap benefits in months and years to come. We're looking at the future of the support service following the authority discussion of that area in November, and also looking at the whole communications activity to ensure that patients, clinic and the public have the right information at the right time, not only this year but in years to come. So in particular on the first work stream relating to the OTR service, not very much to add beyond what we said about the testing of the new IT system. We have staff in place and we're continuing to update work on policies and legal advice to inform the process. And this is, for example, things like frequently asked questions, which we are getting increased similar questions. Who can access the data? I know that my... that I was trying to give an example that was easy, but I can't think of one. Increasing data requests from people who aren't able to access the data. So people who perhaps know one of their parents was a donor, they are not able to access data from the sibling link. People who perhaps had a child that they know was a donor, that person may have passed away, they are not allowed access rights, etc., etc. So we are continuing to do work on the whole of that area. In terms of the future of the support service, this will be coming back to authority later in the year. A detailed business case on that project came to the corporate management group in March, which covers not only a literature review, but what happens internationally. There's some interesting examples from Australia and other countries about how that support is offered. We're looking at both the legality and the practicality of different funding options and continuing ongoing engagement with key stakeholders. And I really want to thank the Donor Conception Network, who've been very supportive of all the work in this area and very available to all our questions and engagement in all areas. And we'll be looking into all those different types of support that is available and looking at what we can come back to authority for a decision later in the year. On communications, I think, as I mentioned, ongoing media interest in this work, particularly because the whole area of donor anonymity was picked up as part of the law reform work. I think we've got a balance to be had in terms of the kind of key public interest in the work and our commitments, if you like, about the communication to clinics on their preparations into former and current donors, donor-conceived individuals and their families. And, really, we could have a team of numerous staff working on this sort of round the clock, and we probably still wouldn't meet the appetite from all of those individual groups as well as the wider media and social media interest in this. Just to touch upon the risks, and I think this is where any authority feedback and input over any new risks or things that we haven't covered. Again, we went into quite a lot of detail about this last time, so I don't want to sort of repeat things unnecessarily. But I think there is a balance about the expectations of kind of what the HFEA can do and our role and responsibilities, the role and responsibilities of clinic staff, and indeed expectations from the information donors had when they consented to treatment and storage 18 years ago, and the expectations for donor-conceived individuals and their families. We cannot manage the relationships that come out of those contacts, but we are at the kind of heart of that information. And we continually, as Peter says, need to assess and reassess what resources we are putting into the kind of core opening the register service. At the moment, there are 4 members of staff whose only job is to service that. As those access requests increase, there will be a judgment the authority will make about what the appropriate number of resources or level of resources that we can devote to that. And lastly, just on the next steps, so we are trying to mitigate the risk where possible through those 3 individual work streams. We've got a lot of internal assurance going on through the Project Assurance Group, which Richard Sidey chairs, as well as updates that Rachel and I are providing both to authority and to the corporate management group and senior management team. We look forward to presenting the options for the support service later in the year to authority, and we'll continue to update and provide engagement both to authority but also to our standard stakeholder engagement group. So we have a meeting of the Licence Centre panel, I think it's next Wednesday afternoon, and then later in the spring both our professional and patient stakeholder groups, and we'll be updating those groups as a whole through those meetings. So I think that's all I want to say formally, and just happy to take questions.
Any questions, comments for Claire on this? No, I mean we've discussed it quite a lot. I think it's going to Cannes. Oh, Catherine, sorry.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Claire. Very comprehensive. Just following on from something that Alex has already mentioned to full authority. Alex and I have been doing a particular piece of oversight work with Rachel and her team on the development and the rollout of these 3 work streams. And I just wanted to endorse what Alex said, which is that we can offer the whole authority a really good degree of assurance about progress along all fronts. And I was particularly pleased to see the slide presented on the assessment of risks associated with OTR. I was also really pleased to see the development in our comms strategy of a comprehensive comms engagement and in particular external comms plans. And I think it is really important that our external comms address both the reputational risks of those things that we can control, notably the degree to which we meet donor-conceived individual and donors' expectations in the rollout of OTR and in the timely rollout, but also that our comms reflect the reputational risk to the HFEA of the elements which are out of our control, but which we've sought to mitigate by offering this multi-layered support service. And I do think it's really important that we tackle head-on expectations, which will result in disappointment for some individuals as a result of OTR.
Zeynep.
Yeah, thank you so much for that update. It's really, really interesting, and it's going to be such an exciting time with this coming forward. It just occurred to me, it was so clear the way you're talking through these things and potentially some of the risks that might be faced by donor-conceived individuals and donors. I was wondering, is it feasible for us to make a little video that donor-conceived individuals are required to watch at some point? Before they receive the information or something. Because I know we've got a lot of that information available at different places on the website, but either with those lovely graphics that we've been using recently for information provision, or just, a talking head, just talking through some of these things in a 5-6 minute video might be a really good way to just communicate to people that, we can't manage the relationship, we don't, people might have different responses, etc., just as a quick way to give that information out.
Thank you. I think that's definitely worth considering in all that comms work that we're doing that looks at the kind of the journey that people get to before they're accessing the information. And there are examples actually in other countries where people kind of need to formally come into the equivalent of the HFEA office and have a kind of session with a person saying kind of, before I give you the information, you need to understand X, Y, and Z, which I think is also something we'd have to think about in terms of the future of the support service. So I think we're good things to think about. Thank you.
Anybody else? Thank you, and thank you, Claire. That was very, very clear. What struck me, actually, the importance of this, was that when we launched the consultation on legislative reform, most of the press and most of the media interest, honed straight in onto donor anonymity, whereas actually the proposals in the consultation are quite wide-ranging, and they over quite a lot of different things. Both the radio interviews, Peter and myself, Claire, and also quite a lot of the press comment literally honed in on donor anonymity. So this is going to be very high profile and really looked at by everybody, not least the media. So it sounds like we're doing all the right things on track, but it is going to create quite a storm when it actually sort of starts being a real thing and people start applying to us for information. So thank you. Claire, it's now you again. As we've mentioned several times, as everybody knows, we launched the consultation on February 28th. Once we have the responses back, sort of end of April, and then we've had a chance also to analyse them, then we'll be able to talk more substantively about it. Perhaps even by the May meeting, we should have some of the analysis done, I would have hoped. But nonetheless, it's worth having a short overview of progress today.
Thanks, Julia. Apologies that it gets the sound of my voice again. Just to give a quick update, if we can go to the next one, please, Shabir. Thank you. Just to give a quick update, and again, this is part of the authority papers that are on our website. So for those people who look on our website, all of those are links to previous authority papers where the full background can be found. So I won't go over that now, but just to say this is a piece of work that we really begun in 2020, so it's been a kind of long time in fruition. Number of authority discussions and formal papers, law reform advisory group set up early in the year to help kind of further refine the broad topics, and the consultation launched in February. We've also received public ministerial support, not necessarily for changes to the Act, but that the HFEA should look at the areas that should be modernised. So if we look at the current position, which is on the next slide, so as Julia said, the consultation was launched at the end of February, looking at 4 areas. I'm delighted to say, because many people outside of this room were involved in weeks and weeks of agonising about the structure of the consultation, where commas and full stops should go. And also a huge number of staff across the organisation were involved in testing that survey that's now on the SurveyMonkey platform. And just thank you to everyone and authority members. I'm pleased to say that the consultation has been very successful in its launch, and I'll say a bit more about that in a second. But just to say that it has probably taken us 3 years to get here, although it was delayed by both COVID and multiple changes in Prime Minister and Secretary of State last year. We go on to the next one, please, Shabir. So where are we to date? So we have received hundreds and hundreds of responses so far. So we're delighted about that. And we've received very positive feedback, not necessarily to say, you know, every question you've asked in the consultation has been wonderful, but mostly when you launch things like that, the immediate feedback is, well, I've tried to answer this and it doesn't work. So that's why I really wanted to thank everyone involved in the testing, because it does work, which is the first success. The second thing to say is that for people who are involved in a range of government and formal consultations, we've had some really positive feedback about how it's structured, that we've made our case for change, we've analysed the issues and we've made our proposals. So I think the feedback has been very positive. You don't have to agree with the proposals, but there is very great positivity towards how it was structured. So that's really helpful to see. As Julia said, we had some widespread media and social media coverage, which I'll talk about in a minute. And thank you to those professional and patient groups and others who've really done a lot of hard work for us to publicise it on the media and social media. We've had a number of people writing blogs, including the director of the Science Museum, who wrote a blog particularly about scientific innovation. We've had a blog from Turi King, who works with Stacey Dooley on the DNA testing programmes, who wrote a blog about the donor anonymity and threats from DNA testing websites. Peter's got a number of speaking engagements next week to patients at Fertility Network, and later in the week from a Progress Educational Trust event with a range of speakers looking at what they would like to see from law reform. As Julia said, we plan to come to the authority in May with a summary of where we are with the consultation responses, particularly if there are any errors in the responses that perhaps challenge where the authority wanted to go, to air out some of those discussions. We can go to the next one, please, Shabir. So just in summary on the media, I mean, I think it's a real... the fact is that this is coverage of a consultation, not coverage of, our recommendations or even that the law has changed. So over 350 pieces of coverage, 17 pieces in national media. As Julia mentioned, the majority of the articles did focus on whether there would be a change to donor anonymity. I think, understandably, it's the most sort of kind of life affecting change. Some of the more technical changes, perhaps about whether there should be a deputy PR, are hugely important to clinic staff, but possibly less to the media. Social media, again, has been very active, in the top performing posts related to the launch and areas we think modernisation. And anyone in the room or anyone listening, very happy for those posts to be reposted and to get as many responses as we can. If we can go on to the next one, I should just have said, which I missed out saying, that is that unlike a patient survey where we're really looking for a representative sample of patients to contribute, this isn't a kind of national sort of vote or necessarily a representative sample. Numbers are good, so the more people who participate, the better, but it may be because of the news coverage that there's a higher proportion of people who are parents of donor-conceived individuals who are responding, or, for example, clinic staff. So we will publish the range of responses in full, but it's not necessarily a representative sample of the British public, the UK public. Outlined a number of risks in July, which I think is just worth mentioning. So given some of the other activities, we've mentioned particularly opening the register. The timetable to complete this work, I think, is tight, which we need to kind of constantly revisit. One of the concerns is that perhaps we've got the issues wrong. So authority agreed the range of issues. Perhaps the kind of response to the consultation is, these are not the important ones. What you should have focused would be X, Y, and Z. We haven't really received that so far, although I think particularly in this section where we covered a range of scientific developments, I think a possibly fair criticism is there's a lot in here, and if all of this came to fruition, perhaps it needs to be broken down a bit more. There may be a lack of consensus on the issues, both from consultation respondees, but also from authority. You may not agree a direction of travel, so that would be a challenge. And there's also a challenge that we receive quite constantly and openly, is that it would be better if there was no specialist regulation of fertility treatment. The creation of life is no longer a kind of special part of medicine, and so that the consultation is used as a kind of response on that wider principle of against regulation of fertility treatment in particular. So next step, so we are, as I said, ongoing promotion through events, blogs, social media on the consultation. We are going to begin to analyse the consultation as we go on. We're going to go through a set of recommendations with hopefully coming through to you. I imagine we may correspond by email before the authority meeting in July. The timetable we're working on is tight, but that would be, the hope is that we can have a kind of approval for the recommendations in July, and those could go to the Department of Health and Social Care before the summer. I think the question to you to review the progress, and I suppose, are you available to engage with that between now and July as well? Because I think we're tight, but we'd like to keep to that timetable as far as possible.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Claire. So firstly, comments, questions, anybody? Ali.
I just wanted to say that I think it's highly unusual to have that amount of press coverage for a consultation, so it's a real testament to the work of the comms team, and underlines the point you made, Julia, about how important their role is in the public being aware of the HFEA's position and our work. So really great work from them.
Gita.
Thank you, Claire. A brilliant summary again. Once again, I would like to echo what Ali said. Brilliant coverage and well done to the comms team. And if I remember correctly, I think it's on the same day the Windsor framework was being announced, and it was all over the news. And I just thought this was great that the consultation got such coverage on a day when the newspapers had this big news. So I don't know about the feedback. I think if I remember correctly, you said you didn't actually have a target number for feedback. But have you got, the important thing is to get representative samples so that you have got representation from different stakeholders, in order to make it meaningful. If you haven't got that, or if you don't receive that by the end of April, would you be extending the deadline? And knowing the pressures that are there, would you consider extending the deadline anyway for the full analysis and going back to the department?
I think on numbers, so when people fill in the survey, they can fill it in a range of ways. So as a private individual who has a view, whether they've had fertility treatment or know someone or just has a view, as an individual, but answering their professional capacity, so lots of clinic staff have answered it, or on behalf of an organisation. And where people have said that they're responding on behalf of an organisation or in a professional capacity and they're happy to provide their details, we're able to see. So for example, if we were expecting responses from the main professional bodies and patient groups and we hadn't got them later, we would be able to follow that up individually. I think if there are concerns around Easter that we're not getting those sorts of responses and actually the timing is the issue, then of course we would look at if we needed to extend the deadline. Judging on where we are at the moment, that doesn't feel like it's going to happen, but I'm happy to come back to you and let you know further.
Catherine.
Thank you. Very positive, very encouraging response so far, Claire. I just wanted to know first whether we feel confident that the current timetable won't be impacted in terms of resources by the Public Bodies Review and potential extensions and delays to the Public Bodies Review. And secondly, whether we could say a little about how we might mitigate the risk of setting up great expectations in the public and stakeholders that we're going to be able to deliver legislative change, which is, of course, not within our control.
I think on the first question, Catherine, I think there are a number of things that may impact the delivery of the timetable for July, and I think we just need to, almost keep a weekly watching brief on that, and we'll update members as and when anything, if it does change, we'll update members. But, I talked with the particular members of team who we're collectively writing the report on, and, we're all committed to trying to achieve that timetable, subject to anything else happening. On the second point, I think that's a real risk, actually, that I didn't identify here, and I know the Audit and Governance Committee mentioned that. So we have, as far as many times as possible, said, and I know Julia did in interviews and Peter as well, this isn't, although we can make recommendations, ultimately it's for government and Parliament. But obviously, if you set people on the expectation that those changes will happen, we will need to do a lot of mitigation when we publish the recommendations, that this is the start of a process that we hope will end up in law reform. But I don't think, given the successful comms activity to date, that we will put the recommendations on a shelf and let them become dusty. So there will at some point be political change, and we will work with this government and any future governments on trying to see those changes come to fruition as soon as possible, because we think they are beneficial both to patients and clinic staff.
Anyone else? I'd just like to make one comment, which I think Claire mentioned, or somebody just sort of in passing. We are grateful up to now that members, and I'm very grateful that members have really engaged with this process. I think the next 2 or 3 months might be sort of quite busy in terms of the team reaching out to you for various, once we get some of the analysis done, well, we might have questions, or members might be asked to, engage further with the process. And I think all I'm saying is I'm well aware of demands on everyone's time, but this is really super important. So I can see lots of nods around the table, but I'm grateful, because we will be asking you, we're probably engaging you more than we would otherwise do, and I think that's your contribution is going to be really important. So I think that's really, on that basis, we can give you back some time now. Just before we do, I have one piece of AOB, which is sort of positive. As you know, sadly, Frances Ashcroft has intimated that she'd like to and will, in fact, step down from the authority because she's had some health issues, which means she can't really continue. She is also a member of SCAC, and we're going to discuss with her whether she remains on SCAC or not, but we'll have to see about that. But she will step down from the authority. That will leave us with one person short. We did have another candidate who we now have approval to appoint. I'll give you further details as and when they're available in terms of name and so on. But all I just want to say is that person appointment has now been approved. So we will move forward. Which I think, given again the demands on the authority time at the moment, will be very helpful. And I think I just want to record that we wish Frances well, and hope that we will keep in touch with her. She is a very eminent scientist, and we're grateful that she's been on this board, even though just for a short time, and hopefully we'll keep in touch with her. Right. Any other business from anybody else? Just moving around the table. No? I'm looking all around. Peter? No. Nothing? Okay. Well, thanks everybody very much. And the next meeting is on May the 18th, I think, isn't it? Yes, I think so.